The attorney's pen dropped onto the table. He didn't pick it up. I watched it roll toward the edge and stop just before it fell, and I thought, that's exactly how this whole thing felt, right on the edge, for years. My brother cleared his throat from across the conference table and straightened his tie. My sister-in-law touched her hair. The estate attorney, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who'd probably delivered news like this 100 times before, looked down at the folder in front of him and then back up at my brother. Not at me. Nobody looked at me. That was fine. I was used to it. Let me back up. I grew up in Holland, Kentucky. Not the postcard version of Appalachia people imagine when they hear that. Not rolling green hills and front porches with sweet tea. I mean the kind of town where the Dollar General is the nicest building on Main Street, and half the storefronts have been empty since before I was born. My father worked 31 years at a distribution warehouse outside of town, the kind of job where your body keeps a running tab and eventually collects. My mother cleaned houses on the days she felt well enough to drive. There were 3 of us kids. My brother Daniel was the oldest. Then me. Then my younger sister Cassie, who moved to Nashville at 19 and built a whole life there that didn't include us much. Daniel was the one everyone talked about at church. He got a full scholarship to the University of Kentucky, graduated with a degree in business, moved to Lexington, married a woman named Brenda whose family had a little money, and eventually opened a chain of 3 auto detailing shops that did well enough that he drove a truck with heated seats and talked about his investment portfolio at Thanksgiving. He never let us forget any of it. I was the one who stayed, not because I had no options. I want to be clear about that, because for a long time I let people assume things I should have corrected. I stayed because someone had to. My father's back gave out the year I turned 22. Not gradually. Suddenly, the way catastrophic things happen, the way a rope doesn't fray and fray and fray, but just snaps one morning when you're loading boxes, and then you're on the floor, and everything is different. 2 surgeries. A third that the surgeon said he wouldn't recommend, but my father insisted on. After that, he could walk, but not far. He couldn't drive. He couldn't drive. His mother had been managing a slow thyroid condition for years that nobody took seriously enough until it became something harder to ignore. By the time I was 24, she had days where she didn't get out of bed before noon, and not because she was lazy, because she was exhausted in a way that sleep didn't fix. I had been accepted to a nursing program at Eastern Kentucky University. I deferred once, then again, then a third time, and eventually I just didn't go back to ask. I got a job at the county hospital as a patient care technician. I learned everything I could learn in that role. I became the person the nurses called for when they needed someone steady. I took every certification course available to me and paid for most of them out of pocket. I drove my parents to appointments. I managed their prescriptions, their paperwork, their insurance disputes. When the insurance company denied my father's physical therapy coverage for the 3rd time, I sat on hold for 2 hours, transferred 6 times, and I did not hang up until someone gave me a supervisor who gave me an answer that was different from no. Daniel sent money occasionally. $200 here, a check at Christmas. Once, a gift card to a grocery store chain we didn't have in Harlan. I thanked him every time. I never told him what things actually cost. I never told him about the year I dipped into my own savings to cover my parents' property taxes. Never told him I'd restructured their mortgage by calling the servicer and spending 3 weeks documenting the hardship. Never mentioned the medical bill I negotiated down from $11,000 to $800 because I'd read enough about hospital billing practices to know that the number on the statement is rarely the number you have to pay. He didn't ask. I didn't offer. That was how we worked. My parents, they loved me. I believe that. But Daniel was the proof of something for them, the evidence that they'd done something right, that something good had come from all those years of hard work and staying put. When they talked about him to people at church or at the grocery store, there was a different light in their faces, a pride that was almost physical. When they talked about me, they were kind. They were grateful. But it was a softer thing, quieter. Once, when I was 27, I overheard my mother on the phone with my aunt. She didn't know I was in the hallway. Claire just kind of putters along, she said. She's good with us. She never really found her thing though. I stood in that hallway for a long time after my mother hung up. I never said anything about it. My father died on a Tuesday in March, 3 years ago. He went quietly in his own bed, which is what he'd wanted. I was there. Daniel drove up from Lexington the next morning. The grief was real and complicated, and I'm not going to rush through it to get to the legal part, because the legal part doesn't make sense without understanding that I had just lost my father, and I was also the one who called the funeral home, chose the casket, wrote the obituary, coordinated with the pastor, ordered the flowers, and made sure there was food at the house after the burial. Daniel gave the eulogy. He did it well. He cried genuinely, and people hugged him afterward. I sat in the front row and held my mother's hand. 3 months later, my mother's attorney, not Gerald Whitmore, a different one, an older man named Franklin, who'd done their paperwork for decades, called to say that my father had left a will and that it should be reviewed with the family present. He said my father had made some updates to it in the last 2 years of his life and that there were some things we should discuss. Daniel drove down again. Brenda came with him this time. We sat in Franklin's office, which smelled like old paper and burnt coffee, and Franklin read the will. My father left the house and the surrounding 2 acres to my mother, which was expected. He left a small savings account to be divided equally between Daniel and Cassie and me, and then Franklin read the next part. The remaining investment account, which none of us had known existed, because my father had never mentioned it, because it had been something he'd built slowly and quietly over 30 years of small contributions that had grown in a way that surprised everyone, including Franklin, who adjusted his glasses when he said the number. He left it entirely to me. $240,000. Daniel went very still. Brenda made a sound that wasn't quite a word. There must be an error, Daniel said. His voice was measured in the way that people get when they're controlling something. Franklin looked at him. There's no error. The account was updated 14 months ago. It's very clear. My father he wasn't always thinking clearly near the end. Daniel set his hands flat on the table. He had medication, he had pain. I'd like to have this reviewed. I looked at my brother. He was thinking clearly, I said. It was the first thing I'd said in that room. You don't know that. I was there every day, Daniel. I know exactly what he was thinking. My brother looked at me then with something in his face that I hadn't seen before. Or maybe I had seen it before and had always looked away from it quickly enough not to have to name it. It was something between anger and something older than anger, something that had been building for a while. This isn't right, he said. This isn't what he would have wanted. That's literally what he wanted, I said. It's in the document. We didn't speak again that day. Daniel hired an attorney within the week. I found out through my mother, who called me crying, saying she didn't know what to do, saying Daniel was saying things about the will and about me that she didn't know how to respond to. I asked her what things. She hesitated. She said Daniel thought I had influenced our father, had taken advantage of his condition, had manipulated a sick, medicated old man into changing a legal document in my favor. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called a legal aid office in Lexington because I couldn't afford a private attorney on what I made, and I explained the situation, and a woman named Patricia took my case. Patricia was 40-something, direct, and did not waste words. The first time we met, she asked me to bring documentation of everything I could document. I brought 4 years of bank statements showing transfers I'd made to cover household expenses. I brought the correspondence with the insurance company. I brought my father's medical records, which I had access to as his designated healthcare proxy, a document he'd signed when he was fully competent, witnessed by 2 people, notarized. I brought a letter my father had written by hand, which Franklin had given me in a sealed envelope at the end of that first meeting, which I had not opened in front of Daniel because something told me not to. My father had written 3 pages in his careful, slanted handwriting. He explained the account. He explained why he'd made the decision he'd made. He wrote about what he'd watched me do over the years, quietly, without complaint, without asking for recognition. He wrote about a specific night, 2 winters before he died. when a pipe burst at 2 in the morning and I'd spent 4 hours in the crawl space under the house in 30-degree weather because the plumber couldn't come until morning and the water had to be shut off from somewhere he couldn't reach. He wrote, "She never once made me feel like a burden. I want her to know that I saw her. I need her to know that." I read that letter for the first time sitting in my car in Patricia's parking lot, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since the day he died. Then I went back inside and gave Patricia a copy. The mediation was held in a conference room in a legal building in Lexington. Neutral ground, technically, though nothing about it felt neutral to me. Daniel had his attorney, a man named Kevin Strauss, who'd probably handled 100 of these and had the particular confidence of someone who wins more than he loses. Patricia sat next to me. My mother had declined to attend, which I understood. Daniel arrived looking like he always looked. Pressed shirt, expensive watch, the version of himself he assembled for professional settings. He nodded at me when he sat down. I nodded back. Strauss opened by characterizing the situation in terms I recognized from the research I'd done: undue influence, diminished capacity, a pattern of isolation. He used words like dependency and manipulation in ways that were technically precise and completely backwards from reality. And I watched him say them and thought about all the hours I'd spent in that house and in those hospital waiting rooms and on hold with insurance adjusters. And I kept my face still. Then he said it. I don't know if he intended it as a legal argument or as something more personal, but it landed the same way either way. He said that I had not demonstrated any particular professional achievement or contribution to the family's well-being that would justify this kind of preferential inheritance. He said that my brother had built a successful business, had raised a family, had been the primary financial contributor to his parents' well-being over the years. He said I had, by contrast, remained underemployed in a limited role in a rural area, which suggested I had little capacity to manage assets of this magnitude. The room was quiet. Patricia put her pen down, and then she opened the folder in front of her. She didn't raise her voice. Patricia was not a raised voice kind of person. She spoke the way people speak when they know they don't have to perform certainty because they actually have it. She placed the bank statements on the table first. 43 months of records showing transfers from my personal account to my parents' household account, mortgage servicer, utility companies, and medical providers. A total of just over $68,000 over that period. Daniel looked at the statements. Something shifted in his face. Patricia placed the insurance correspondence next. 41 documented communications over a 2-year period related to my father's coverage disputes, the resolution letters, the amounts reversed, the physical therapy sessions that happened because I had not stopped pushing. She placed the healthcare proxy documentation, the date it was signed, the 2 witnesses, the notary stamp, my father, fully competent, making a legal and deliberate choice. She placed the letter last. She didn't read it aloud. She just put it there and let Strauss read the first paragraph, which was enough. Kevin Strauss was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Daniel. Daniel was looking at the bank statements. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the table, the same way they'd been flat on the table in Franklin's office 3 months earlier. "Mr. Whitmore," Patricia said. She was talking to Daniel now, not to Strauss. "Your sister has lived for the last several years of her life on a patient care technician's salary of approximately $34,000 a year. During that time, she contributed more than $68,000 to your parents' household. She managed their medical care, their insurance, their home maintenance, and their financial paperwork without compensation and without recognition. Your father was aware of this. He documented it. He made a legal, witnessed, notarized decision to acknowledge it." She paused. The claim that she exerted undue influence over a man who wrote 3 pages by hand, explaining exactly why he made this decision. I think you'll find that argument difficult to sustain. Strauss leaned over and said something quietly to Daniel. Daniel didn't respond to him. He was still looking at the statements. And then for the first time in that room, he looked at me, really looked at me. Not the way he had in Franklin's office, with that tight, controlled anger. Something different, something that took longer to form. $68,000, he said. "A little more than that," I said. I stopped keeping close track around year 3. He was quiet. I didn't know, he said. I know you didn't. Why didn't you? He stopped, started again. Why didn't you ever say anything? I thought about my mother on the phone saying I'd never really found my thing. I thought about the Christmas gift cards. I thought about the eulogies and the front rows and the different lights in people's faces. I wasn't doing it to be noticed, I said. I was doing it because it needed to be done. The mediation went on for another hour. The formal stuff, the language and the terms and the paperwork. But the real thing had already happened. In that pause after Patricia put the letter on the table, Daniel withdrew the contest. He called me 2 weeks later, not a text, an actual call, which was unusual for him. I was at work, on a break, sitting in my car in the hospital parking lot eating a sandwich. I almost didn't answer. I did. He didn't lead with an apology, which I appreciated in a strange way, because a man like Daniel leading with an apology would have felt like a performance. Instead, he said he'd been going through some of our father's papers and had found some things he hadn't known about. Things that filled in a picture he hadn't been paying close enough attention to see. He said he'd called Cassie and told her some of it. He said he thought maybe we should all come together at some point at the house, while our mother was still there, and the house was still there, and there was still something to gather around. I think I owe you more than a phone call, he said. You don't owe me anything, I said, but I'd like that, coming together. There was a long pause. I didn't realize, he said, what it cost you. It didn't feel like a cost at the time, I said. And that was the truest thing I said that whole conversation, because it didn't. It still doesn't. I would do all of it again. But I'm glad someone knows now. We came together in October, at the house in Harlan with the cracked front porch step and the apple tree in the side yard that had been there longer than any of us. My mother made her potato soup, the kind with the sharp cheddar on top that I've never been able to replicate exactly no matter how many times she's shown me. Daniel sat at the kitchen table with his coat still on for the first 20 minutes, the way he always does in rooms that feel unfamiliar even when they shouldn't. Brenda helped with the dishes. Cassie showed up an hour late with wine and loud apologies and filled every quiet corner of the room with noise, the way she always has, and I was so glad to see her I could barely stand it. At some point in the evening, Daniel and I ended up on the back porch. It was cold. We could see our breath. The yard was dark except for the light from the kitchen window. He said he'd been thinking about what he would have done in my position if he'd been the one who stayed. I don't think I could have done what you did, he said. You would have, I said. If you'd been the one here, you would have. I'm not entirely sure I believe that, but it seemed like the right thing to say, and maybe it was also a little bit true. He put his arm around my shoulder briefly, the way brothers do who are not in the habit of it, and then went back inside. I stayed out a little longer. The apple tree in the yard was bare, just branches against the dark sky. In the spring, it would be full of white blossoms that lasted about 2 weeks and then blew everywhere. And my father used to complain about the petals clogging the gutters, and every year he complained and every year he never cut the tree down. I think about that a lot. Some things you keep not because they're convenient, because they're yours, because they were there before you, and you hope they'll be there after. I went back inside when the cold got to be too much. My mother was laughing at something Cassie had said, that particular laugh she has, that's almost a cough, and the soup was still warm on the stove, and all of us were in the same room. That was enough. That was more than enough. That has always been enough. I've thought a lot about what it means to be seen. Not celebrated, just seen. There's a difference, and it took me a long time to understand that I'd been confusing the two. For years I told myself it didn't matter, that I wasn't doing any of it for recognition. And that was true. I wasn't. But somewhere underneath the truth of that was a quieter thing I didn't let myself look at directly. The part of me that wondered if doing the right thing, quietly, without applause, actually counted for anything in the end, whether it left any mark at all. My father answered that question from 3 pages of notebook paper. He answered it after he was gone, which is the kind of thing that stays with you. What I've come to understand, slowly, not all at once, is that the way we live accumulates. Every decision compounds. Every time I sat on hold for 2 hours fighting an insurance denial, every check I wrote that I didn't tell anyone about, every night I drove my parents to an appointment and drove back home and went to work the next morning. None of it disappeared. It went somewhere. It built something. Not a reputation, not a trophy. Something harder to name and harder to take away. Daniel wasn't a villain. I want to be clear about that because the easy version of this story makes him one, and that would be dishonest. He made choices based on what he could see, and what he could see was limited by the distance he put between himself and home. That's not cruelty. That's the ordinary blindness that comes from not being present. We all have versions of it. The things we don't see because we're not standing in the right place to see them. What the mediation room taught me, what Patricia Langell's bank statements on the table taught me, is that the truth doesn't need you to defend it. It just needs documentation. It needs you to have actually done the thing, and to have done it long enough and consistently enough that the record speaks for itself. That's not strategy. That's just integrity operating over time. The hardest part of this whole story isn't the legal piece. The hardest part is the years before that, when I was 31,000 feet below anyone's notice, and I had to decide over and over whether I was going to do the right thing anyway, whether I was going to keep showing up for people who didn't fully understand what showing up cost. That decision doesn't get easier because someone eventually notices. You have to make it before anyone notices. That's the only version that means anything. I'm not telling this story to make my brother look small or to make myself look noble. I'm telling it because I spent a long time thinking that staying quiet meant staying invisible, that choosing not to perform my sacrifice meant it didn't register, and I was wrong about that. My father saw it. He saw all of it, right down to the pipe in the crawl space at 2 in the morning. You are not invisible just because no one has said so yet. Do the work anyway. Keep the records not as ammunition but as evidence of your own life, your own choices, your own quiet accumulation of character. There will come a moment, in a conference room or a kitchen or a back porch in October, when the full picture comes into focus for someone who needed to see it, and that moment will be enough. It really will.